simply was a friendship in state politics as close as the Cellucci-Weld bond. And this might be a good time to bring in a gentleman who certainly knows both sides of the political spectrum, because he has worked with both sides, and he's good enough to spend some time with us this afternoon. And Ray Howell, thank you so much for being with us. You know everybody. You certainly knew every important player in the Weld-Cellucci administration and across the aisle. This was quite a man.
This was a great guy and a humble guy. And as you pointed out earlier, he and Bill Weld made a great team. I think they were the best political team in the history of Massachusetts. They complemented each other in terms of what they focused on and their personalities and their styles. They were a great team.
You know, you mentioned that team, and when I spoke with Governor Weld back in May of 2011, when I was putting the story together about Governor Cellucci, one of the things that Mr. Weld said to me was that he felt that the two of them had grown to probably have the closest political bond of any active elective team that he had ever known or ever been a part of. And so besides being political friends, they were very close personal friends as well. And I'm sure you worked with both of them. You saw that relationship develop.
They were great personal friends, or they became great personal friends. They didn't start out that way. The first meeting they had together to talk about whether to run together as governor and lieutenant governor, which, as you know, was a first. Paul had a bowl of pasta, which was a staple for him, and a glass of wine, and Bill had a glass of milk, and Paul said to himself, this is not going to work. But they, as you pointed out, they became great friends by working together over the years, and they did complement each other. If Paul cared about something strongly, Bill would say, Paul, whatever you want. And then the opposite was true. On the big issues, they usually agreed, but if they didn't, they would go in private, no staff, they would talk it out, they'd work it out, and then they'd come out and say, okay, here's our decision. And even the staff didn't know who had given what, who had given in. So they really were seamless.
And that was the story for their years together, both in and out of politics. I mean, it was mutual respect.
It was mutual respect. And, you know, they really were co-governors, and they really were equal partners. And Bill made that clear. But Paul was very humble, and he was very respectful of Bill and the office of the governor. And he always made it clear that there's only one governor here. And I'll give you one example of that. Every morning they started off their day with a staff meeting with their senior staff, maybe 8 or 10 people around an Oval Office in the governor's office. And Bill sat at the head of the table, Paul sat at the other end of the table. And when Bill went away, if he was out of town or out of the country, traveling, Paul, of course, became the acting governor. And he made a point of not sitting in that chair, in Bill's chair, because he wanted to make it clear that there's only one governor. Even though Bill Weld didn't see it that way, Paul did.
You know, Bill Weld also said that he called Paul Cellucci simply an amazingly principled person, an amazingly loyal person. And he also told me that there was nothing that he wouldn't do for Paul Cellucci. That's how close they were. And when you think about Mr. Cellucci's span of 30 decades in public service, Mr. Weld said to me that this was just truly his campaign for ALS was a continuation of that public service, and he supported him 100% in those efforts.
It was, and you make a good point about Paul being passionate and caring about issues. I mean, he was a gentleman, and he was a humble guy, and he did believe in bipartisan compromise. But that's not to say that he didn't feel strongly about some things, and he did. For example, throughout his political career, he was pro-choice on the controversial issue of abortion. And that cost him in his own party. But he was unwavering from his first days in politics that he was pro-choice. On the other end of the spectrum, he was, again, strongly against tax increases as bad fiscal and economic policy. And that, you know, he was criticized and even ridiculed by some in the media, by the sort of downtown establishment for that position, but he never wavered. He had some bedrock, fundamental things that he believed in, and he fought hard for them. I mean, he was a happy warrior, but he was a warrior.
Well, he was one of the people. I mean, and I think that that has resonated repeatedly in the last few days, if not during the Weld Cellucci years. Paul Cellucci came from the suburbs. Paul Cellucci came from working class parents. Paul Cellucci came from knowing what people wanted. And he was a guy, by all accounts, who made his decisions based on what he knew to be the priorities himself.
That's so true, Susan. I mean, this was a guy who was governor. He was ambassador to Canada. He was a close personal friend of 2 United States presidents, yet his family and the town of Hudson was the center of his universe. And Susan, as you know, I think you know this guy, his best friend was his barber from Hudson, a guy named Bobby Yezway. And, you know, he really did walk with kings, but keep the common touch, as Kipling's poem indicated. Hudson was his life.
Hudson was his life, but I'll tell you, you know, recently we've heard so much about all that Paul Cellucci did for ALS research since his diagnosis, and I just have to make a personal comment here. Over the many years that I've been in, well, I think everybody knows I grew up in Natick and not that far from Hudson, and I've known Paul Cellucci for years and years. This was a guy who worked for these causes before. It was not just after his diagnosis. I mean, we need to be clear about that.
That's true. He always had a soft spot for people who needed help, and you know, he believed in government as a useful tool to help people. You know, one of his causes from, again, the beginning of his career was domestic violence. He fought against domestic violence for his entire career, and he religiously attended the monthly meetings of the governor's domestic violence commission. He talked to the victims. He'd often come back to the office with tears in his eyes. But it's not something that he trumpeted. It's not something that he talked about or bragged about or even campaigned on. But he cared about it.
It's just who he was, no question.
Yeah.
We're seeing Attorney General Martha Coakley there, alongside her, Tom Finneran, and the list goes on and on, as we were saying. There's Tom Birmingham is there as well, and we are expecting the House Speaker, Bob DeLeo, to start off the program in just a few minutes, as he will welcome everyone in his capacity as Speaker of the House.
You know, go back to that point that you were just making about his efforts to be involved in a lot of these issues prior to his diagnosis. He, in fact, signed into legislation what made UMass Medical Center the established institution that it is today, and that was well before his diagnosis. That was when he was in office, I believe, back many years ago now. So as you were saying, Ray, this was something that he was very involved with prior to even knowing that this would be his outcome.
That's absolutely true. And, you know, Paul, listen, Paul was a politician, and he took care of you know, his hometown, and he took care of Central Massachusetts. So he was always a big booster of UMass Medical. We used to joke with him that half of the population of Hudson was on the state payroll. So he took care of the hometown.
But as we have mentioned several times, it was both sides of the aisle in the hometown, as we just a few minutes ago saw in the crowd. The former Senate President, Billy Bulger, who, sitting next to the State Treasurer Grossman, was the president of the Senate during the Weld Cellucci years, and boy, were there stories there, Ray.
Yes, that was an interesting time in Massachusetts politics, and you know, one of the, you know, Paul Cellucci is known for sort of his bipartisan approach to politics, and Bill Weld was the same way. And one of the reasons that they were so successful is that they were able to work with a Democratic legislature. And we see now in Washington what happens with gridlock. It doesn't matter how good the ideas are. If there's gridlock and nothing gets passed, then nothing happens. And they were able to work with the legislature. And Paul was a huge part of that, because these guys knew him. It's not just that Paul knew the process, which he did, but the leaders knew him and trusted him. They didn't know Bill Weld. They didn't trust him, right, at first, because he was a cop, right? He was a former prosecutor. Yeah. But Paul was one of them. He could talk to them. They trusted him.
Janet Wu is down at the State House for us right now. And Janet, you knew Governor Paul Cellucci for all of the years that he was in public office, and covered him many, many times and met him on many, many occasions. Your thoughts this morning?
Well, I mean, everything that you've been talking about, I haven't heard all of it because I was on my way down here to the State House. But the one thing that's really sort of hit me in the last few days is everyone talks about what a wonderful man Paul Cellucci is, and there was not a sound of falsehood in anything that he ever said or anything he did. Everything rang true about him. But the one thing that I think that people sometimes, and I think Ray's been talking about a little bit, was just how smart he was politically, because he always downplayed it. And in those early days, part of the reason that Bill Weld chose him to be his running mate, and back then it was a novel idea for someone who was running for governor to pick a running mate, was because of Paul's experience at the State House. He was already, I think they're about to bring this to a start. But one of the things that I think that one of the reasons Bill Weld picked him, and I think he would admit it, was because of Paul's lengthy experience at the State House. He had been a state rep and a state senator for 20 years, well over 20 years, and it was his political experience. He knew where all the bodies were buried inside of the State House. He knew all the players. He knew the politics of Massachusetts, and for Bill Weld, it was brand new. And for many of the people, including Ray and Ginny Buckingham and Rob Gray, they were all new to Massachusetts politics. And having his experience, having him know who the players were, I think was so instrumental to much of their success in that first term.
You bring up a very interesting point about him knowing so much politically and what he achieved. We're expecting the welcome to be delivered by the Speaker of the House, Robert DeLeo, in just a few moments here as this remembrance service gets underway. One of the things that Governor Cellucci said he wanted his legacy to be, he was really very proud of a number of things. He felt that he helped get rid of the label of Texachusetts here in Massachusetts, because one of the very first things he did on his first day as governor was to cut income taxes right away, and he was very proud of that. And he also said he was very proud of working not only with Governor Weld, but Tom Birmingham and Tom Finneran. We've seen them in the hall today. And he felt that he put so many of the resources back into urban schools and held for accountability and looked for standards. And he also was very proud of the early stages of health care. And he talked a lot about the infrastructure, also the Big Dig and the new runway and Old Colony Line, and of course the medical school. So he had a lot of things that he had his hands on during his time in office, things that will be with us for generations to come.
And the term lobbying, Ray, it didn't have the same connotation back in those days as it seems to these days.
No, it didn't. And one of the bipartisan cooperation doesn't have quite the same reputation these days. But one of the ways that they were successful is that they instituted a weekly meeting with the leaders of the Democratic legislature. And the goal of this weekly meeting, which had never been done before, was to cool down any debate that was public policy debate that was getting nasty. It was actually to head off any debate from getting nasty or personal. And Bill and Paul knew that if you sat down with people every week across the table, it was going to be that much harder to take personal shots or to get nasty in the public debate. And those meetings were key to them getting a lot of business done with the legislature.
There are snapshots in this crowd that we're looking at right now that are historic. Bill Weld, former governor, and Jane Swift. And it's a moment of silence in the State House with the governors standing at full attention. There you see Governor Dukakis, as well as
Mitt Romney.
Right, Governor Mitt Romney.
Jane Swift, and of course Governor Weld, as the casket is rolled into the front of the hall.
Among the honorary pallbearers, Lieutenant Colonel James Hannafin, retired Major Dan Grabowski, Major Billy Christensen, Detective Lieutenant James Coughlin, Lieutenant John Cahill, also retired, and Trooper Joe Lawless, also retired, and Troopers Anthony DeCicco, Stephen Howard, John McGuire, Deborah Thompson, and Trooper Lionel Davis.
As the remembrance service gets underway, as we mentioned, the welcome will be delivered by the Speaker of the House, Robert DeLeo. The opening prayer will be given by Reverend William Leahy, who is the 25th president of Boston College. Let's listen in.